Okay, so let's move on to copyright first. I think copyright is probably one of the most complicated IP rights you can come across, but I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible for the purposes of today. As I mentioned before, copyright covers any sort of expressive work. So if you are doing a painting, making a sculpture, writing a book, composing some music, all of these things would be protectable in copyright. But copyright doesn't just cover those traditional forms of art. It also covers more mundane things. As I mentioned, things like instruction manuals potentially could be covered by copyright, reports, brochures, all of these types of slightly more boring things you might create could potentially be protected in copyright. Also, fundamentally to today's society, especially on the internet, copyright also protects computer software. So if you write a piece of computer code and someone copies that computer code and tries to sell it or use it for their own purposes, you could potentially sue that person in copyright for taking your original code. There are some complexities with that. Again, I won't really be going into it, but it covers a very broad range of things. So those are the original types of works, or they're now called under the Copyright Act 2021. They're called authorial works. And if you create something from your brain, so you have an idea, you write it down on paper, then the form of that idea on the paper gets protection in copyright. We'll go into more detail on how that works in a second. Copyright also protects a number of sort of secondary things, so secondary creations that you might make. So if, for example, you make a sound recording and you want to then make money from that sound recording by selling it to people, that's possible, and you can protect that business by enforcing your copyright in the sound recording. Copyright also covers films, broadcasts, and live performances. And the interesting thing about copyright is that one type of IP right can encompass many other types of IP right. So if you have a sound recording, then within that sound recording, you may have music, which would be protected as an authorial work. And you may have lyrics, which would be protected as a literary work. So if a different person made the sound recording and a different person wrote the music and a different person wrote the lyrics, then you would have 3 owners of copyright to address if you wanted to use that sound recording. Okay, requirements for copyright. I mentioned before, there's no registration requirement for copyright. You simply need to create the work from your own brain. So you have an idea, you picture it in your head, and then you draw it, or you write it down, or you put it into music notation, something like that. And that is when it is created. So what you need to fulfill, the only criteria is that for authorial works, your work must be original in the sense that it is not copied from elsewhere. So it comes from your own mind and it doesn't come from some external source that you've copied it from. That's the first criteria. The second is that it must be substantial. And this is just a kind of threshold requirement. So you don't get copyright for things like the word "and." Okay, it's simply too insubstantial to gain copyright protection. So your expression must be sufficiently substantial in order to be identifiable as your individual contribution to the world. So that's number 2. And number 3 is that it must be tangible. It must be fixed in some sort of semi-permanent way. So for example, if you make latte art, so say for example, you're someone who makes little pictures on top of people's coffee, that's probably insufficiently tangible to receive copyright protection. But if you were to take a picture of your latte art, then you could potentially get protection for that latte art at that point, because you've made it tangible by creating that permanent record of the thing. Permanent records can also be things like digital files, can be handwritten notes, can be typewritten notes. Many things can be tangible in the sense that is required by the Copyright Act, but it does need some degree of permanency. So it does need to be able to exist long enough, basically, for the courts to be able to assess what is your copyright. Okay, so that's the three basic requirements. For authorial works, I mentioned that what is protected is the expression of your ideas. And what that implies is that the idea itself is not protectable, right? So if you have an idea for a business, for a board game, for, design of a card or something, but it's just the principles behind the idea. So the principles of the design are X, Y, and Z. That is not protectable in copyright. You would need to find some other IP right that would be able to protect that. So maybe you file, for example, a registered design or a patent, or you keep the information confidential, which allows you to prevent other people from using it. What copyright does protect, on the other hand, is the expression of your ideas. So the way that you have turned that idea into a tangible thing. So I take the idea of, for example, in the case of A Bug's Life, I take the idea of an ant that is a bit of a stranger in his colony. He causes trouble in the colony. He gets kicked out of the colony. He finds a group of friends. He comes back to the colony to discover that the colony has been overridden by an invasive species. He uses his strangeness, his quirkiness to get rid of the invasive species, and then gets to marry the princess because he was such a hero. Okay, so that's the idea behind A Bug's Life. And if you know the film, if you've seen it, or if you go on Wikipedia, you'll see that that is the exact same storyline as Ants. Which both came out incidentally in the same year. So the exact same storyline. But when you look at the content of the film is very different. So the dialogue that the characters have, the artwork, the nature, the tone of the film is overall different from the idea behind the story. So what that basically means is that if you want to write a comic book about superheroes, then you can write a comic book about superheroes, whether they wear capes, whether they're kind of bat people, whether they're, superhuman green aliens. You can create that comic book, provided that you don't copy the actual content of the comic book from another source. Okay, so very interesting, very important principle to understand in copyright law. So I'll just leave that there. It's a very complicated thing to try and get your head around, but I think the basic point I wanted to make is that copyright covers your actual expression, but not the idea that you had that caused that expression to come out. Okay, so if you have a board game and you want to protect it, yes, you can protect the design of the box of the board game. Yes, you can protect the design of the pieces of the board game. But what you cannot protect is the concept behind it. So you roll the dice and your character moves around the board is unprotectable in copyright law because it's simply an idea that you had. Okay, so that's that. So basically the upshot of that is there are a variety of types of information that simply cannot get protection in copyright law. And this is good and bad. And the reason that this distinction exists is that we are trying to protect the creative contribution that people offer, not necessarily prevent other people from using the ideas to create their own version of whatever it is. So what we usually say in copyright law terms is that facts, ideas, discoveries, and concepts are not protectable. So if you find, for example, information that you think is relevant to your report. So say you find a table of statistics on IPOS website or on stats.gov.sg. That table of information, provided that the compilation of the table wasn't in itself creative, so maybe they put the table together in an interesting way that could get copyright protection. But otherwise, if it's just a basic list, say in alphabetical form, so it goes from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then it tells you some related information to all of this, you can use that information again, because it is simply information and not the representation of somebody's expression. That's the kind of basic point about copyright law.